Now, Marx picks up and develops these threads of argument about a decade later. In the 1860s, he doesn't really write much about this kind of stuff, but in the 1870s, he starts to. And there's three strands of his writing in the 1870s. The first of these is the changes he introduces in the French edition of Capital, which is the second or third edition, depending on how you look at it, of Capital Volume 1. Was not a German edition, but a French edition. And there's some parts of that that never made it into the standard English, or until very recently, German editions of Capital. And one of these quotes that's actually been used to attack Marx in the English-speaking world reads as follows. Talking about the pre-capitalist societies of England and Western Europe and how they were torn apart by capitalism. This is a process called the primitive accumulation of capital. And so Marx writes, the expropriation of the agricultural producer of the peasant from the soil is the base of the whole process. He's talking about the way the peasants were driven off the land, agriculture consolidated into large commercial farms, peasants driven off eventually to become the urban working classes or the immigrants to places like the United States or Australia or the Caribbean. Only in England, which we therefore take as example, has it the classic form, he writes. So this phrase classic form is in there, and people have interpreted that Marx thinks in more or less a cookie-cutter fashion that India or Russia, these societies that were then outside the orbit of capitalism, he's saying they're going to follow the same pathway, that they have to inevitably follow the same pathway. But in the French edition, this passage reads differently. It had time to alter it, think about it more, clarify it, whatever. So he writes the following. Expropriation of the peasants, he repeats that part. Then he writes this. England is the only country where this has been carried through completely. All the countries of Western Europe are going through the same development. So it's very explicit there, qualifying it to Western Europe, this kind of development of tearing the peasants off the land. It's taking an open position as to what's going to happen in the rest of the world. Okay. The second strand in the late writings, we're talking now the 1870s and early 1880s, he dies in 1883, concerns Russia. In several texts, Marx examines anew the issue of Russia, whether Russia and the other agrarian empires of Asia were destined to modernize in the Western manner. There's an 1877 letter responding to a criticism of capital in Russia, where the critics had said, you know, Marx is assuming that Russia has to go through these same steps as in the West, and we don't agree with that. And then some of his supporters were saying, no, we agree with Marx. We do have to go through all those same steps. So Marx was actually more pissed off in a way at his supporters than his critics. And so he wrote this letter clarifying his position, where he said that he denied that he had developed a historical philosophical theory of the general course fatally imposed upon all peoples. That is not what he had done in Capital, but that he had limited it to Western Europe. And he quotes that sentence there from that I just quoted to you from Capital. Now there's another letter that's even more famous, which is to the Russian revolutionary Vera Zazulych. And again, Vera Zazulych asks him explicitly, is Russia destined to be swept onto the pathway of capitalist development that was already taking place in Western Europe? Again, Marx concludes that alternate pathways of development might be possible. He based his judgment in large part on the marked differences between the social structure of the Russian village, which is still pre-capitalist, with its communal property, and the village under Western feudalism, which had to a great extent, more individualized property relations. There were also other features of society that were quite different from that of the Russian peasant. He's learned Russian by this time, and he says that his studies of Russian society had, quote, convinced me that the commune, this communal structure in the village, is the fulcrum for a social regeneration in Russia. Now, he writes a lot of drafts of these letters, too, and one of them, he says, well, what about India? That maybe there's some relationship to India, maybe there isn't. In any case, these kind of communal structures were no longer common in Western Europe, even in the feudal period. And then he and Engels write a preface to the Communist Manifesto in 1882. It's his last published writing, as far as I'm aware. And there he says, that the communal social formations of Russia are not only interesting, not only could Russia have different social development, but resistance based on these villages to modernization, to capitalist modernization, could be the starting point for a communist revolution at an international level if it could link up with the revolutionary labor movement of the Western capitalist countries. Now, these are all like small texts, like a few sentences in the French edition of Capital, a few letters and so on toward the end of his life. But here's like the biggie in terms of quantity, his notebooks. Marx is spending a good part of the time in the last 5 or 6 years of his life writing notes on studies by other authors of India, Indonesia, Algeria, Egypt, Latin America, and other societies that we might call part of the global south or pre-capitalist societies. And some of these notes have yet to be published in any language, and I'm part of the group that's editing them, although a lot of them have been published, although they're not in like widely circulated editions. Now, one of the books that Marx annotates heavily in this period is a young Russian anthropologist book called Communal Land Ownership, which was published in Russian in 1879. And Marx's Russian is good enough by this time that he's like, reading this whole thing, he takes like, it's going to be a couple hundred pages when it's published. It's a couple hundred pages typed double-spaced anyway, these notes. And then there's another book in English, Robert Sewell's Analytical History of India. Now, these notes just on India alone, I mean, India in those days comprised the whole subcontinent, what we call Pakistan and Bangladesh. Those divisions had not occurred. So, talking about India as a whole, that subcontinent, these are 90,000 words. So this is like the size of a book. This is not like some small letter or something like that. Now, most of it is his summary and copying out of passages from these books. It's not his own words, but he does put his own words in, and I'm going to quote some of them. Now, in these notes on Kovalevsky's book, Marx examines social relations, especially in terms of communal property, across the entirety of Indian history, from the very early period to the period of the Muslim conquest during the European Middle Ages, to that of British colonialism beginning in the 17th century. And Marx closely follows Kovalevsky's historical typology of communal forms in rural India, and he sees several stages of development within these communal forms, that the early ones were organized around kinship groups, but then later on it just was based on whether you were a resident of the village or not. And this similar process had taken place in Russia. And Marx also writes of social antagonisms, because once you get out of the kinship model and then you have the village-based one, it becomes a question of defining who is and isn't in the village and all these kinds of things and what people's shares are. And so there's social antagonisms and conflict. So it would certainly appear, although he never says so, I think one can read these notes as suggesting that India, he no longer saw India as an unchanging society without any history, as he had written in 1853. That was one of his big criticisms. Now, another aspect of Marx's notes on Kovalevsky deal with the impact of Muslim rule on these earlier social relations, because Muslim conquer, Arab and then later Persian conquerors keep coming in. So what is that relationship? And anyway, in this part where he's talking about the Muslim, the Mughal Empire, the largest and most, the longest of these empires, here he rejects, not only does he not use the term feudal, because in the Grundrisse he doesn't use the term feudal, but he doesn't attack the use of the term feudal to describe this society. Here he attacks Kovalevsky for using the term feudal to describe pre-capitalist, pre-imperialist, or pre-British India. Now, he appreciates Kovalevsky for a lot of things, because Kovalevsky is very critical of colonialism. And as Marx is talking about the period of the British, he goes back into the Sepoy Rebellion again. He talks about Cornwallis, who we know from U.S. history as the general of the British armies, but the British didn't fire him after that. They sent him over to India, where he did something really horrific, which is he during his governor generalship, they developed what they called the permanent settlement, where they created Western-style capitalist property in the villages. And one of the results of that was the peasants started getting dispossessed, because when they couldn't pay their debts to the moneylenders or landlords, then they said, oh, you can't pay? Well, kick you off your land, we'll sell your land. But in pre-British India, land could not be freely bought and sold in that way. So capitalist relations of private property were introduced, and people were fleeced out of their land. He calls the British dogs, asses, oxen, blockheads, and so forth, alludes to a general hatred of the British government, celebrates the Sepoy uprising, again, and he discerns, he says that even though these things have been broken up in the villages by Cornwallis's reorganization of agriculture and land ownership, still, among these atoms, because society is becoming atomized, as under Western capitalism, still, he says, among these atoms, certain relationships endure from a distance reminiscent of the earlier landowning groups of the communal village. And that's Marx's own remark. So this suggests a link between the notes on India and the writings on Russia. If these communal relationships endure, might they not also serve as points of resistance to capital and to imperialism? Marx answers this by indicating that it was not so much the preservation of these forms as their forceful dissolution and disruption in the name of economic progress that could unleash new social forces dangerous to British rule. So it's the disruption and the masses of people being thrown out of work and into very harsh work conditions that creates a crisis that could become a danger. And of course, there was this crisis of the Sepoy uprising in 1857. Now, Marx also looks as I mentioned, the analytical history of India, which is more about political and military developments, all the different conquerors marching through, and so forth. And here it's strongly suggested by Marx's remarks and his selection of material that he no longer saw India as a society without a history, and he also no longer saw India as an unresisting society. So again and again, in these notes on Sewell's history of India, Marx's notes emphasize the contingent character of the Muslim and British conquest, rather than, as in 1853, the ineluctable march of large historical forces. In 1853, almost was like India was destined, to be taken over by, more advanced society. He kind of uses that kind of language. Here, at every stage, he highlights indigenous Indian resistance to foreign conquest and how, in many cases, the conqueror succeeded just by a thread, and it could have gone in the other direction. Here's an example. He talks a lot about the Marathas, based around the area that's now Mumbai or Bombay, as it was called. Now, a Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, in 1704, this is one of the last important Mughal emperors before the British really took over everything. And so he's getting into wars with the Marathas, who are an Indian resistance group based in the Hindu community. So here's what Marx writes in his notes. 1704, in the last 4 years of his life, whole government disorganized. Marathas began to recover their forts and gather strength. A terrible famine exhausted the provisions for troops and drained the treasury. Soldiers mutinous over want of pay. Hard pressed by the Marathas, Emperor Aurangzeb retreated in great confusion to Ahmadnagar. So this is how he writes about 1704. In another description of the Marathas, Marx uses the word clan ancestor in a description of Maratha leadership, thus highlighting the notion that the Marathas, who formed the most important locus of Indian resistance to the Mughals and later to the British, were organized on a clan basis. None of the above is meant to suggest that Marx's notes on India are anti-Muslim. Because he does celebrate our resistance to Muslim conquerors, but at one point he writes about the greatest Mughal emperor, Akbar, who Marx writes, made Delhi into the greatest and finest city then existing in the world, and he portrays Akbar in a relatively secular light, characterizing him as indifferent in religious matters and therefore tolerant of all religions. Marx devotes the bulk of the notes on Sewell's history of India to the period of British ascendancy, where he stresses, as I mentioned, the contingent character of Britain's conquest and the many instances where its power in India hung by a thread. He frequently terms the British blockheads or dogs, whom he sometimes describes in rather graphic language as terribly frightened, shitting in their pants at one point in the face of Indian resistance. Throughout these notes, Marx shows a pronounced sympathy for the Marathas, this Hindu-based resistance movement, while occasionally expressing disdain for their warlordism. He doesn't see them as like a positive alternative in terms of their political structure. And the notes on Sewell suggest that Marx's sympathy for the Sepoy uprising had only increased in the last 20 years. Okay, the second part of my talk, which is much briefer, I want to look at another aspect of the book, which deals more with modern Western societies of the time, of Marx's time. The American Civil War, Poland and Ireland. Well, Poland, not a modern Western society, but occupied by two fairly modern societies, Austria and Prussia, in addition to Russia. Okay, now, Marx and Engels were always concerned with Poland and with, as most progressives, Democrats and socialists of that time, Poland was like one of the chief causes throughout the whole 19th century. In other words, in France once there was a revolutionary uprising and they started saying down with the king, and then they said Viva la Polonia. That was just like a slogan that would like come to people's lips, because Poland was a country that had been basically destroyed in the late 18th century, and the Poles were fighting to reestablish their country. Now, a lot of people know the phrase in the Communist Manifesto that says the workers have no country, and people that interpret that as that Marx had no consideration or understanding of nationalism. But in fact, if you go to the demands of the communists at the end, which a lot of people don't read all the way to the end, it says, we support the progressive part of the Polish national movement, the part that believes in confiscating the land of the aristocracy as part of the fight for Polish independence. And later on, in the 1850s, Marx writes to Engels that support for Poland or lack thereof is a litmus test for the revolutionary movement. And once the First International gets started in the 1860s, one of his biggest fights with the followers of Proudhon, the anarchist utopian socialists, is over Poland, because the Proudhonists, in addition to other problems that Marx saw with them, were sympathetic to Russia rather than Poland. They're also unsympathetic to the idea that the workers' movement should take up these political causes that weren't directly related to labor questions, like Polish independence. And to the end of his life, Marx is noting this kind of thing. He notes, for example, that in the Paris Commune, some of the important military leaders were Polish, because the Poles had so much experience, military experience with all these uprisings and so on.